Welcome everybody to this 90 minutes talking about the life and work of Stuart Hood. I'm David Johnson from the Open University. The event is being hosted by me, Sally Blackburn-Daniels, and David Hutchison, who will be, between the three of us, sort of doing the chairing and the technical stuff. And also we're having 10 speakers who I'll introduce as we go through the event, the next 90 minutes. Briefly, just the protocols and the program. The first hour we're going to have 10 speakers talking about different aspects of Stuart Hood's life and work. As people talk, feel free to type comments and questions into the chat box, because in the final 20 minutes, David Hutchison will pick up on those questions and we'll give people the opportunity to make contributions themselves or ask the speakers to elaborate on different points. After that first hour of the 10 speakers, all 10 speakers could easily speak for an hour without drawing breath about Stuart Hood, but we've asked them to focus very much on what they take to be his key contribution, both at the time when he was writing and working, and for us now to think about why we should bother to think about his ideas and thoughts now. So those are the kind of, that's the kind of how we're going to focus things. The session will be recorded and it will then be posted on the Institute of English Studies website. Very briefly, before I hand over to the first speaker, I just thought I'd run through all of you will know something about Stuart Hood, but I just thought I'd emphasize some of his key achievements and the reason why we are spending more time on him today. It's probably, he's just running through this chronologically, a very, very remarkable war experience of the war, and especially the year he fought fighting with the partisans in Italy, both the biographical dimension, but then his memoir, Pebbles from My Skull, also with the alternative title of Carlino. And four of our speakers are going to pick up on that. Terry Brotherston, Hilary Horrocks, Nick Haverley, and Phil Cook are going to talk about that part of his life. The next chapter was, again, a very distinguished period at the BBC, culminating in 3 years as controller of programs at BBC Television, when he commissioned, part of the modernising moment, where commissioned Z-Cars. That was the week that was Doctor Who, oversaw the launch of BBC Two, and crucially provided openings for a generation of really radical and innovative figures like Ken Loach and Tony Garnett. He left the BBC in 1964 and then wrote a great deal about those experiences and was one of the founding figures of media studies, 4 or 5 books that became set texts and were very important. And David Hutchison will tell us more about that. In the 90s, he started also writing in the beginner series. You will have seen that on the introductory scheme. Fascism for Beginners, Holocaust for Beginners, and Desaad for Beginners. We're lucky to have Haim Brasheeth, who co-authored the Holocaust with Beginners. He's going to talk for us today. He was, through the 70s and 80s, a major public intellectual. Adding up, I've came across over 200 reviews and articles he published through that period, so we'll be reflecting on that. But then the final 2 aspects of his work and life that we're going to talk about are his work as a translator. He translated over 40 works from Italian, German, French, and Russian. Major Italian writers, Flaiano, Pasolini, Dario Fo, Dino Buzzati, Stephen Watts and Stefan Hoevwelt will speak about Stuart as a translator. And finally, he wrote 8 novels, and Alan Riach and I will talk about those. One of the contributors to the book, which is part of what we're talking about today, we've just edited a book, David Hutchison and I, called Stuart Hood, 20th Century Partisan. One of the contributors was Tony Garnett, the radical filmmaker, producer, director, screenwriter, and Tony knew Stuart very well and wrote a very moving entry for chapter for the book. And I thought I'd just end off by quoting the last paragraph of Tony's tribute, because it sets up the life and the work of Stuart Hood in quite a powerful way. I'll just read that and then hand over to Terry. Tony Garnett writes, Hood's life encompassed most of the 20th century. 2 terrible wars devastating Europe, a Bolshevik revolution in Russia, its corruption into Stalinism, a devastating world slump, the rise of the Nazis and unimaginable acts of atrocity, a post-war attempt to rethink socialist possibilities. A man whose socialist principles were inevitably fixed in the 30s slump, trying to make his way through the minefield of choices and the bitter disappointments familiar to everyone on the left. But if he was just a man of his time, what a time and what a man. So with that, as I say, those quite rousing words, I want to hand over to the first speaker, Terry Brotherston. Terry is an honorary research fellow in history at the University of Aberdeen, and it's appropriate that we start off with Terry because more than anyone, he is the reason we're here today. He organized 2 conferences in 2015 on Stuart Hood, one in Edinburgh, one in London. And he's got an extraordinary knowledge and grasp. He knew Stuart well, and he'll kick off for us. So over to you, Terry.
Thank you. Well, picking up from what David just said and the quote from Tony Garnett, for me, reflecting on Stuart's importance, which is what I was asked to do, very much dovetails with why I thought it was worth trying to organize with others' help the 2 conferences we had for Stuart's posthumous 100th birthday, and that they generated much of the material for the book. In writing the chapter covering Stuart's early years in small-town Presbyterian Scotland, northeast Scotland, and his time as a student in the 1930s Edinburgh, as he said, in the shadows of fascism and war, I wanted to argue that it was his experiences then and the way he reflected on them that gave unity to a life of such fascinating variety, in a sense, many lives. And to suggest further that by understanding that underlying unity, that essential integrity, we can find in Stuart Hood's an angle on the 20th century that might help new generations of scholars and political activists to rescue hope and inspiration from the century's tragedies and the shattered dreams of human liberation with which it began. So that's the objective intention of my chapter, but I should warn that my approach is subjective and personal. It pivots on a date in late 1973, when the Trotskyist group I joined 3 years earlier was planning its relaunch as the Workers' Revolutionary Party, the notorious WRP, on the basis of the theory that Britain was in a pre-revolutionary situation and that the coming revolution would be analogous to the October Revolution of 1917, led by a Bolshevik-type party. The first part of the theory, of course, proved wrong, but the socio-economic and political chaos at the time gave it some credibility. The second part was, as a historian, I say this ruefully, historically obtuse. But it did take many would-be radicals, and not only those in the WRP, many years to understand that, and some have not done so yet. In 1973, I was already pretty exhausted following a period of relentless activism the group demanded, and wondering if my political conscience would allow me an escape route when I heard that Stuart Hood was joining the new party. Now that helped overcome my doubts and strengthen my resolve for 2 reasons. First, Stuart's name had meant something to me since at least 1964, when his resignation from the BBC hit the headlines. Did he jump or was he pushed, said one. I now know Stuart's action took his colleagues aback. One had to verify the resignation letter against the signature on his copy of Stuart's war memoir, Pebbles from My Skull, before he was convinced that it was genuine. At the time, I assumed that Stuart had been pushed because as controller of television, he had facilitated the satirical review That Was the Week That Was, which was considered dangerously anti-establishment. It was, of course, no such thing, but it had played a role in my intellectual awakening from an adolescence spent in conservative and still Tory 1950s Edinburgh. Reading Pebbles also assisted my rethinking of assumptions about World War II, acquired from more orthodox war books and films my war widow mother had encouraged me to consume in adolescence. And politically, as I became disillusioned with the Labour Party, Stuart's documentary on the Soviet oppositionists, Daniel and Sinyavsky, helped convince me of the importance of a left-wing critique of so-called communism, of Stalinism, to any serious socialist movement. So Stuart's political decision, a professionally experienced, intellectually mature, anti-Stalinist socialist to join the WRP, had a big impact on me. I later learned that it greatly surprised most of his friends, but as Tony Garnett's essays shows, it was not taken lightly. The second thing for me was a sense of fellow feeling I derived from Stuart's being a Scot, and one whose sensitivity to the formative influence of his particular type of Scottishness was politically uncontaminated by what at that time still seemed the unequivocally reactionary cause of Scottish nationalism. Stuart's only lasting contribution to the WRP during his brief membership was a few articles in the party's Labour Review. To me, they seem to make contact with empirical reality in a way increasingly absent from much of the party's mainstream writing. And soon after the WRP imploded in moral confusion and political irrelevance after the 1984-5 miners' strike, I reviewed Stuart's novel A Storm from Paradise. I thought it combined a Scottish sensibility with an awareness of European history in a most compelling way. Stuart said he liked the review, and that led to a series of meetings and discussions, and through them I came to see his significance more objectively. The process was aided in the late 1980s by Robert Lumley's long Edinburgh Review interview, which he'll speak about, and by Don Coates's documentary film, A View from Cato Thun, in which Stuart returns to his roots and reflects on his life and on the state of Scotland in the 80s. He once told me, Stuart did, that to Aristotle's man is a political animal, we must add that human beings are storytelling animals, and that it is by telling each other stories that we convince ourselves we are not mad. His story helps me to see that though it was a seriously misguided to remain in the WRP as long as I did, in deciding to join, I was not mad. I hope, though, that my chapter helps take the reader beyond that personal angle and into the roots of the whole story, a truly significant one, too little known, of a man who, flawed like the rest of us, though he no doubt was, led a life of real achievement, and whose reflections on it afford potentially inspirational insights into the century that generated the truly historic crisis that we all have to find ways of confronting today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Terry. I'll move on immediately to our second speaker, Hilary Horrocks. Hilary's an editor and writer who knew Stuart Hood during the same period when he was with the WRP in the 70s, and is currently copy editor of Modern Italy, the journal of the Association for the Study of Modern Italy. Hilary's traced Stuart's journey as a partisan in Tuscany, and has spent time with the people who remember the events he took part in and are also the custodians of that memory. So over to you, Hilary.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, David. A few years ago, when I first started retracing the wartime footsteps of Stuart in Tuscany, we came across by chance a commemorative event involving the ANPI, the Veteran Partisan Organisation. I went and introduced myself to them as an old friend of Carlino, the name Stuart was given by the partisans, and I was immediately surrounded by elderly well-wishers and invited to carry on the conversation over lunch. No explanation was necessary, so present still is the memory of his and others' roles in the resistance. Stuart became one of the stories of the resistance in Tuscany. Indeed, the figure of Carlino became so much of a legend that on a return visit in 1981 to a village where he had taken refuge during the war, Stuart was told by a bartender that he had never really existed. His wartime autobiography, Pebbles from My Skull, and many subsequent interviews and articles reveal an exceptional character, someone who was, by all accounts, an excellent professional soldier, but who had enlisted specifically to fight fascism and who had the courage to act fully on his convictions. Do I have a picture here, Sally? Here he is in military uniform. Here he is in military uniform. I imagine this was taken shortly after enlisting. Captured by Italian troops in Egypt, he ended up in a POW camp for Allied officers near Parma. The author, Eric Newby, who was in the same prison, wrote of how their fellow inmates regarded Stuart as bolshy and odd, not only for his political convictions, but because he was an intellectual, and because most suspiciously of all, he actually spoke Italian. After the Italian armistice with the Allies in September 1943, the governor of Stuart's prison opened the gates and the prisoners marched out into a German-occupied northern Italy. Most of them fled north towards neutral Switzerland or south towards the distant Allied lines, and many were recaptured. Exceptionally, Stuart decided to head for the mountains and Tuscany beyond, having heard rumours that the resistance was active in that area. After a grueling 3-month journey over the Apennines in worsening weather, he and his companion were taken in by a partisan organiser who'd recognised their British Army boots. Stuart's independent view of the war made him clear-eyed about the relationship between the Allies and the Italian resistance. In general, the British military establishment looked down on the Italians. Stuart was scathing about the failure of the British government to give meaningful recognition to the Italian peasant families who, at great risk to themselves, sheltered the POWs as well as the partisans. Stuart also identified how the Allied High Command, especially its British component, consistently underestimated and undermined the resistance. He spoke from personal experience about the frustrating RAF drops to the partisans, which seldom contained the type of arms they needed. In the latter stages of the war, Britain and the US feared above all the political empowerment of the partisans and the emergence of a left-wing peacetime government in Italy. But Stuart was also critical of the partisans, and in this respect too, he was exceptional, in that he never presented the fighters he knew as the unqualified heroes that they became in what Stuart called the authorised version of the resistance. There's only time to give one example here of his critique. This is the barn in the hills north of Prato, where Stuart's partisan group, after a 1944 New Year party with the neighbouring families, were surrounded and outnumbered as they slept by a troop of local fascists. Stuart had been worried about the casual atmosphere in the group and about the critical failure to post lookouts during the night. This is not mentioned in a heroic narrative about the incident that now forms part of a memorial exhibition in the reconstructed barn. In his insistence on exposing the myths that arose around the ambush that became known as the Battle of Vallibona, Stuart's writings remain an important contribution to drawing up an accurate balance sheet of the resistance, without giving ground in any way to those who have wanted to prove that the partisans were as bad as the fascists. Stuart's final resistance assignment was to be put in command of a group within a highly organised network around Siena. You can still see a fascinating collection of their documents and maps in the city archive. Here is his false identity card provided by the resistance, which gave him access to Siena as Luigi Neri, a member of the civilian police. Significant in his reflections on this period are his honesty and pain about the deaths he had to order, which haunted him for the rest of his life and which reoccur in many of his novels. So there are all these elements that make Pebbles from My Skull utterly different from the hundreds of British war memoirs that were published and filmed in the post-war decades. Unlike most of them, I think it still speaks to us and to a younger generation. What is still lacking is an Italian version. I know there's interest in publishing one, and hopefully this will be successful. It'll be very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hilary. And over to our next speaker, Nick Haverley. Nick's Emeritus Professor of English and Related Literature at the University of York, and is one of the world's leading Dante scholars, and certainly on receptions of Dante with his British public. So Nick, over to you.
Thanks, David. As my chapter in the book shows, I crossed paths with Stuart Hood and his partisan memories in some quite specific areas of landscape and literature. The Tuscan Apennines and the reading of Dante. So I'm going to focus now briefly on how Hood mattered and still matters primarily with regard to Italy. That significance for me might be roughly summarized in just two words: conscience and range. To address conscience first then, much of what mattered about Hood in his time, and I think as Hilary has just been pointing out, and arguably still matters, derived from his experience and memories of what has been called the Italian Civil War, which in his case lasted from that time in December 1943, when he joined the Partisans in the Apennines, to July 1944, when he rejoined the Allies in Siena. Those experiences, as has been mentioned several times, are reflected directly in his memoirs of 1963, and much later, for example, in his Partisan Memories article in History Today in 2001. In both of those texts, Hood's awareness of social and political divisions in Italy, and more particularly of the choices and traumas of partisan conflict, remain raw and powerful. As he explained in a chance encounter with a German priest that is described at the end of the 1963 memoir, he was and continued to be oppressed by, quote, the deaths I had on my conscience and the difficulty of decision when all points of reference are gone. And he revisits that concern, as we've just heard, you know, in both in his novels and throughout his life, and 40 years later, even, awareness of what he would then call, quote, the cruel logic of partisan warfare, end quote, still informs that article in History Today on partisan memories. And in that same article, he immediately repeats that earlier confession, quote, I had deaths on my conscience. Secondly, and looking at the extent of what I've called Hood's range, I'm reminded that one of his Italian contemporaries, and himself a former partisan, was described as, quote, un comunista inquieto, a restless communist. That political restlessness is, I think, reflected in the immense amount of variety and activities and output that we'll be hearing about and have heard about, and which is addressed in this book: memoirs, novels, TV, film, and translation. It's those 40 or so translations in particular, to me, convey most strongly the two ways in which, as I've suggested, Hood matters. That is, the range of his accomplishment in, say, French, German, Russian, as well as Italian, and furthermore, the way in which many of those translations reflect, as Stephen Watts and David Johnson have expressed it in their chapter, quote, ethical or political commitment. It's striking to me that 25 of the translations are from Italian, ranging in time and content from a version of the surrealism or magical realism of the great storyteller Dino Buzzati in 1952 to the vivid autobiographical realism of one of the major novels of World War II that Hood translated, Beppe Fenoglio's Il Partigiano Johnny, which was Hood's last published translation in 1995. Now, in 2021, it's, amongst other things, a Dante anniversary year. And given such a range of interests and strength of political consciousness, it would be interesting to know if Hood ever thought of translating any part of that medieval partisan poet's work, the Commedia. But perhaps, like some of the most interesting modern appropriations of the Inferno, Hood's 1963 memoir, Pebbles from My Skull, with its Dantean epigraphs and its original disturbing title, is itself a kind of translation of hell, and one that derived from its writer's own post-war productive purgatory.
Thanks very much, Nick. That's terrific. Thanks. And yeah, just move straight on to our next speaker, who is Phil Cook. Phil is Professor of Italian History and Culture at Strathclyde University, and written many publications about post-war Italian history, notably The Legacy of the Italian Resistance in 2011. Over to you, Phil.
Yes, thank you very much, David, and thank you to everyone for their contributions to this wonderful event. Particularly actually Nicholas and Hilary, because in many ways you referred to a number of things that I wanted to talk about. So I will probably just go over these ideas aspects a little bit quicker than I originally planned to. I mean, it was through the translation, the 1995 translation of Il Partigiano Giorni, of Fenoglio's Il Partigiano Giorni, that I got to know Stuart. I'd heard that he was coming up to the Edinburgh Science Festival, and I'd seen that he translated Fenoglio, so I managed to get in touch with him, and he very kindly invited me to lunch in an Italian restaurant just off Leith Walk. And I mean, obviously, as happens, I was a rather nervous young man, and to be seated in front of such an individual was rather daunting for me. But he immediately put me at my ease, and I was really struck by the way he was able to sort of tease out of me my interest without, a man of enormous intellect, without appearing in any way superior. And just one or two of the aspects of that conversation that I remember. One was on the topic of the word for rag in Italian. He knew about 10 words for a rag in Italian, and he'd picked these up obviously when he'd been with the peasants, during that period of the Second World War. And he reeled out, straccio was the obvious one. He said to me, how do you say rag in Italian? I said straccio, it was the only one I knew. And he had about 15 other words for rags. And this really sort of alerted me to his linguistic sensibilities, his enormous and very impressive knowledge of languages, not just Italian, but many others. And I think if we want to ask ourselves why is Stuart still relevant today, post Brexit, I hate to mention that word in this forum, but somebody of those multilingual skills and that interest in other cultures and other languages that Stuart had, that really is a fantastic example, it seems to me, to young people today, and of the value of languages. Because my God, if he'd not been able to speak Italian, if he'd not been able to communicate in Italian, we wouldn't be here talking about him today. He wouldn't have survived the war. It was, I think, above all, his linguistic skills and his communication skills, which got him through it. The power of languages. I mean, here we are all trying to justify the value of language study. Well, there is one. He did did Italian and English, did he not, at Edinburgh? And that certainly sort of served him well. So the translation of Partigiano Giorni, we talked about as well this idea of the resistance as a civil war. This had come out in Pavone's 1991 book. It had been an idea which for many years, many decades had been buried. And in Hilary's chapter as well, she mentions this and Stuart's belief that it was a civil war, something that he'd always believed in, and off we went, and we talked about that for some time as well. Stuart actually appears in a couple of footnotes in Pavone's book. So Pavone, the historian, had obviously read it in English, and let's hope that the translation does come out. So he struck me as I say, as an extraordinarily interesting individual. We met on I think a couple of times subsequent to that. I think just to pick up on some of the things that Hilary said as well, the issue of the Allies and the relationship between the Allied forces and the resistance, absolutely crucial theme running through the historiography of the resistance movement. A very polarized historiography, it has to be said. And I think one of the things that experiences and Stuart's books tell us as well is the experience of these British soldiers on the ground, you know. Not the Alexander, the high level, the officers, but those people that liaised and fought with the resistance forces, and in many cases fought and died as well. And I think that's one of the key aspects that comes out of that book. But I think just in general terms as well, just going back to that lunch that I had with Stuart, he always struck me as somebody who wanted to have a discussion, who quite liked an argument. I said to him, I didn't think he translated Fenolia's use of English in the way that I would have done. And he came back to me, and there we were. It was quite a sort of ding-dong affair, and particularly after a couple of glasses of wine as well. It was actually really very enjoyable. And I just want to finish, though, because I think this business about Stuart being contrary, being somebody who didn't just sort of take accepted views, and who liked to do things differently. And I think that's the thing. That's an example as well to us all, to be a little bit different, and to not necessarily accept received opinions or authorities. And it's the quotation that Hilary alluded to earlier from Newby's memoir, Love and War in the Apennines. I just want to read the whole section, because I think it really does capture Stuart. And I'm grateful to you, Hilary, for actually reminding me of this, because when I read the book originally, I'd never actually realised that it was this was Stuart. So I'll just finish on this quotation. The intellectuals in the camp, of whom there were not many, were most of them not even marginally okay. One, who subsequently became a very successful leader of the Italian partisans, was regarded as being what they described as bolshy and odd. Not because he was not a good soldier, which they had to admit he was, but because every opinion that he held was completely at variance with their own about the war and why it was being fought and why he was fighting it, and about the sort of Britain which would emerge as a result of it. And most suspicious of all, he had actually learned to read and write Italian. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Phil. And move immediately on to our next speaker, which is Haim Brasheeth. Haim is a filmmaker, photographer, and film studies scholar, retired from the University of East London, and now at SOAS. He co-wrote the beginner's book with Stuart Hood, and his latest book, which is just out, is an army like no other: How the Israel Defense Force Made a Nation, which is terrific. Plug for that. But Haim, over to you. Just an appeal to our speakers. Inevitably, we're all going over a little over time, so just to bear in mind the 5 minutes cut off. Thanks.
Thanks. While my chapter is a memoir of personal and professional friendship and partnership with Stuart, at variance with many of the other pieces in the volume, here I would like to speak about Stuart's personal and literary interest, as demonstrated in his novel, The Upper Hand of 1987. I think it tells us much about him. This novel is special in a number of ways, but also indicative of Stuart's typical concerns and obsessions. Like much of his work, it deals with the interplay between specific individuals and their social context. He was invested in the ambiguous interaction between power and revolt, examined through class and gender relations, but in this novel, another element is introduced: national identity. It is the story of two Scottish distant friends, exiled from their background, attracted by the pull of the wider world represented by London, the global city. The novel examines issues of loyalty and betrayal and the taking of sides in a very hostile environment. The betrayal, an indirect murder of Colin Elphinstone by his countryman John Melville, harks back to ancient leitmotifs, much older even than those of Jesus and Judas Iscariot. This is an intimate betrayal, all the more painful for that. This is also a very Scottish betrayal, bringing to mind the Scottish play. Betrayal stirred by greed, envy, and the wish to displace and replace the betrayed friend, who, like Duncan, is naive enough never to suspect his opponent. Colin and John are set up as competitors from the start, when Colin, son of the local laird, suggests a friendly conflict, a game of golf, a Scottish rivalry indeed. John wins against the odds, and this marks the rest of his life. For once, he, lower middle class boy, defeats the upper class Colin with every door open before him. Colin surfs to Oxford, while John would just about squeeze into Edinburgh. Following his golf win, John measures his life and his meager achievements against those of his foe, Colin. He would get by through providing information on his lefty colleagues and students to the iconic Hull Crow of the Secret Service, and will then graduate to more complex acts of betrayal and finally to the destruction of Colin. On rereading The Upper Hand, one notices references to a much earlier narrative of betrayal by another outsider working hard to pass in London's English society. I refer, of course, to Joseph Conrad, 1911, Under Western Eyes. One of his best, which, as he notes many times, was spurned by its English audience when it was first published. Few points would have to suffice to point out lines of similarity and difference. While Conrad is writing 6 years before the October Revolution, Stuart is writing 4 years before the collapse of the USSR. The historical expanse between both novels is also the duration of the communist system. Of course, neither author could foresee the future, but somehow both novels do exactly that. Both deal with competing young men whose relationship is asymmetrical. They are never really close. The victim is misguided about his betrayer, trusting until the bitter end. In both cases, they compete in related fields, the conflict radiating to the sexual / emotional arena, destroying innocent women in its wake. While the two empires behind the secret powers are different, their methods are somewhat similar, as are the powers over those serving them. It is fascinating that in both novels, the betrayers remain alive to continue a painful and miserable existence, having murdered not only their friend, but something very essential within themselves. I very much wish I could discuss this relationship with Stuart. We discussed many other novels, but unfortunately, never Conrad's. Thank you.
Thanks very, very much, Haim, for those thoughts. Yeah, it's a favorite novel of mine too, so no, very, very, very illuminating. Next speaker is Bob Lumley, who is Emeritus Professor of Italian Cultural History at UCL. Bob's set of interviews with Stuart Hood were carried out between October 84 and April 86 and published in the Edinburgh Review in 1988. They're by far the richest and most extensive resource of Stuart Hood talking about himself, and they've extensive extracts appear in the book that we've just published at the end of last year. Bob's publications, he also translated Gianni Celati's Voices from the Plains. Stuart Hood also translated Celati, and Bob's also written about cinema and history, with picking up on many of the themes central to Stuart's work: violence and war, politics and ethics, film and memory. So over to you, Bob.
Thank you very much. First of all, I should say that this is a little bit off-piste. in as far as I won't be talking very much about the interview. And what I'm going to say has got a little title, and the title is Notes Towards a New Entry in the Index under W. W for water. My contribution to this event is to talk about the importance of water in Stuart Hood's writings, and I'll refer in particular to Pebbles from My Skull, A Storm from Paradise, and The Upper Hand. Landscapes feature strongly in all of them. The places of Stuart's childhood and adolescence, the Apennines of the escaped prisoner of war and partisan. Hood was a master of description. In his precise topographies of the external world, description acts as a means of survival and control. Descriptions are also embodied in evocations of the touch, the feel, and the smell of situations. Water, between War Office and Wednesday Play. This proposed addition to the index will contain references to chapters by Terry Brotherston, Hilary Horrocks, and Nick Haverley, among others. It will also refer to chapters not yet written. Here are some of the subdivisions of the entry. Rivers, actual and mythical. The actual. The Taro, the Palma, the Ensa, and the Sequia that cut through the Tuscan hills. The Arbia, the Arno. The Esk near Edsall in Angus, Scotland. The mythical waters, those that divide the world of the living and the world of the dead. The dark, unearthly waters of Charon and his ferryboat. See also Dante. The rivers crossed, thanks to luck, a moonless night and a guide, with German patrols on the road nearby. Sea, at Montrose and along the coast between Aberdeen and Dundee, fishing boats and fishermen and fishermen's daughters. The tide, the ebb and flow, rock pools, pebbles stir and rattle, pebbles from my skull. By now, professional indexers would be tearing their hair out, but there's a good case to be made for adding water to the list. Pebbles from My Skull, A Storm from Paradise, and The Upper Hand all begin with watery landscapes. The shoreline where water and land meet is a meeting place of thoughts. Liminal, a stretched threshold. The sea and ports are important for the economy. Fishing and farming were the main industries. Stuart Hood was a materialist. He never forgot that people had to work and eat. Water is symbolic as well. It recurs. The line of nets forms a second shoreline that is scarcely. They have been put there to lead unwary fish into traps. There is a lot to be said, a lot of history. The Gothic line of Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the fortification he built to defend northern Italy, then under German occupation. The Rubicon and Julius Caesar, the importance of the crossing. I want to finish with a final thought. Water in the book of Genesis. Unstable as the water, thou shalt not excel. The father's terrible quotation haunted the author of Pebbles from My Skull. It is the Scottish Presbyterian injunction to work, the Protestant work ethic encapsulated. Water means waste, the dispersal of energies, unproductiveness. But when the line is uttered in the novel or memoir, it is at a moment when the exhausted man feels release from a burden. He has overcome the inner enemy represented by the curse of wateryness and the curse of the father. He has also escaped the enemy in the outside world. He can feel at one with a place where water is a friend. Many waters course through the writings of Stuart Hood.
Thank you very much, Bob. Thanks. Our next speaker is David Hutchison, who co-edited the book with me. And David's honorary professor in media policy at Glasgow Caledonia University, and the author of a number of books, collected editions on modern Scottish theatre, media policy in Scotland, and related matters. So, David, over to you.
Okay, Stuart Hood was rather unusual as a media studies academic. He was one of a very small number of such people who, before writing about broadcasting, had actually had substantial experience working in it. He couldn't be accused of being an ignorant outsider, a charge which has occasionally been levelled at some media studies academics. It's an accusation that's made much less frequently now, certainly as far as courses in journalism in universities are concerned, for rather a lot of former practitioners from the press and broadcasting are to be found working in these courses in academia these days. If you look at his writings about the media, there are issues that come up again and again. And he tells us: control, accountability, and access. Who gets to broadcast? Under what rules do they operate? Who sets these rules? And behind these concerns, there is, of course, the issue of where the money comes from. There were live issues when he was writing. As far as control is concerned and the interaction with the regulatory bodies and the politicians who ultimately set the framework in which broadcasting operates, he refers to several controversies in the past, but one in particular worth mentioning was the war game controversy from 1965, after Stuart, of course, had left the corporation. BBC had commissioned a documentary drama from Peter Watkins, which sought to portray the effect of a nuclear attack on the UK. When senior managers and governors saw the film, after discussion with the Home Office and the military, they decided not to transmit it. It was finally shown in television in 1985, though the rather comic aspect of it was that it could be seen in art house cinemas in the 1960s, the assumption, of course, being that the audiences for such cinemas could handle such a terribly devastating account of what might happen if there were a nuclear war. He also, of course, discusses the ongoing difficulties broadcasters had handling the conflict in Northern Ireland. He's none too kind to boards of governors and regulatory bodies and the decisions they sometimes made. As far as the money, finance is concerned, even 30, 40 years ago in his writing, he was worrying about the dangers of a two-tier system developing, where ability to pay became the determining factor of access. Well, the pressure from politicians and regulatory bodies is still there. Witness the tensions between the current government and the broadcasters, particularly with the BBC over Brexit. And then there is the very difficult financial situation, which the public service broadcasters now face. Loss of advertising revenue to the online sector, the internet and other competitors. And of course, there have been attacks on the licence fee by successive governments since 2010. BBC has been compelled to pay for things it never paid for before, such as the full cost of S4C in Wales and a large part of the world service. And now more recently, it was forced into a difficult choice over the free licenses for the over 75s, a provision brought in by Gordon Brown as part of social security provision rather than really cultural. And there are questions too about whether there have been questions about whether non-payment should be decriminalised, non-payment of the licence fee. Well, the government has backed off from changing that, but it's an issue lurking in the background. And of course, the current government has made it very clear that it wishes to review the whole business of having a licence fee at all. Now, it seems to me that the net effect of all this has been not just to cut the BBC budget, but to also render future financing uncertain. And with that, the stability of the whole public service broadcasting system in the UK. And then to return to Hood's concern with accountability, there are serious questions to be asked about whether consolidating the regulation of all broadcasting under Ofcom will ultimately lead to a cautious, no-risk, tick-box approach, or whether, on the other hand, it will lead to positive regulation. That is to say, regulation which encourages high-quality programming, diversity of programming, and the willingness to take risks and take them fairly frequently. Indeed, the kind of programming which Stuart Hood himself presided over when he was in charge of BBC television output in the 1960s. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. And the next two speakers are going to talk about Stuart Hood as a translator. First up is Stephen Watts, who is himself a poet, translator, editor, and bibliography of translation. His most recent books of his own poetry are Ancient Sunlight and of Dogs, and Republic of Dogs, Republic of Birds. Stephen, over to you. Sorry, I can't see Stephen. Is he turning up? There we go.
Translation is a vital art, pumping lifeblood through the heart. I want to see Stuart Hood's relationship to translation in two ways quickly, and I thank a number of earlier speakers, particularly Nicholas Haverley and Phil Cook, for covering a lot of the ground already. Translation was a lifeline for Stuart Hood. He was not a translator because he came to it from an academic understanding. He was a translator because translation and the understanding of language, the praxis of language, when stood on the earth and looking into other people's eyes, had saved his life. That is the reason he was a translator, in my opinion. And the other sense, not of lifeline, but of line of life. For me, there is a trajectory right through his life, going back to his childhood and the Angus dialect and its huge difference from London English, for instance. But the language he spoke in Italy and the translation work he did after the war, to me seems one of a kind with the work that he also did at the BBC and in media studies. There seems to be a real beautiful logic between all of them. So lifeline, life-saving, and line of life. Stuart Hood had a wonderful range, scope, and trajectory in terms of what he translated, and an equally intense ethics and rage and conscience, those words have been used before, in what he understood of literature and what he understood of translation. I think maybe the best way I can very briefly cover that is by quoting a couple of poems of Erich Fried that Stuart Hood translated, that I think show the relevance both when he was alive, but the relevance now. A question of definition. Is a democracy in which one may not say that it is not a real democracy, really a real democracy? And a poem that actually Robert Lumley quotes in his piece in the book. Have no doubts about the one who tells you he is afraid, but be afraid of the one who tells you he has no doubts. Stuart was a friend of Erich Fried for maybe 40 years, and he wrote very, very beautifully about Fried. This is one thing he said of Fried. His creative powers rested in his ability to reach down into the deepest measures of his psyche, to confront what he discovered there and to endure the most profound and painful emotions. He spoke as few others were able to speak, to that generation whose parents had lived as adults through the 30s and the war. What set him apart and gave his words a particular resonance was that he was prepared to speak about the politics of the past and the present with indignation, but also with humanity. That was Stuart Hood talking about Erich Fried, but I think that is very, very true of Stuart Hood as well. And just finally, if I have time, one of the other great writers that Stuart Hood translated, Pier Paolo Pasolini, who I think Hood was drawn to because of Pasolini's understanding, incredibly deep understanding of Italian society and the traumatic changes that Italian society went through the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. And I'm just going to read briefly from the Hood's afterword to Carlino, the Carcanet edition of Pebbles from My Skull. It leads me to reiterate what is, I believe, one of the most important discoveries I made during a time which was marked by many things that were difficult, frightening, and painful. That in a world of cruelty and oppression, there are still people who have generous impulses, courage, and understanding. It is something that gives me, even in these dark and terrible times, when in so much of the world, cruel and powerful forces have the ascendancy, a certain hope still. For me, that also encapsulates something about Stuart Hood and surely speaks of when he was alive, but although things may be even more terrible now for us going into the future. So many other things to say about him as a translator, but thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Stephen. That's great. And moving on next to Stefan Hoevwelt. Stefan is a literary critic and publicist from Switzerland who worked as an editor and freelance on several Swiss newspapers. He's published in German biographies of George Orwell and Eric Ambler, and I mean, he's also had a very decades of interest in Stuart Hood and has translated 3 of Hood's books into German: Carlino, The Brutal Heart, and the Book of Judith. So over to you, Stefan.
Well, many thanks. I don't want to speak so much about Stuart Hood as a translator, but about his knowledge of foreign literature and about his dealing with translation in language, and then about him as a European intellectual. As you said, I'm from Switzerland, but in the 90s I lived in London, and there I met Stuart Hood in 1993. I was searching for an English translation of Peter Weiss's monumental novel Aesthetics of Resistance, Ästhetik des Widerstands. And a friend told me that he knew a translator who was working on this translation. So I established a contact via his publisher and met Stuart Hood at Villa Carlotta in Soho. At that time, it was a self-serving restaurant, which seemed to be nondescript to me, but which, as Hood explained, used to be a meeting point for Italian anti-fascists during the Second World War. Hood, it became clear, knew the works of Peter Weiss very well, although he hadn't translated it, but he told me about translations of other books by German authors like Ernst Jünger, Eric Fried, and Hans Magnus Enzensberger. And it just occurred to me that there is another connection between Hood, Dante, and Peter Weiss, because Peter Weiss, shortly before his death, tried to write sort of a Divina Commedia for his time, the 70s and 80s. Now, anyway, I was fascinated by his wide-ranging knowledge, read his autobiographical book, Carlino, and decided sometime later to translate it into German. Now, in preparation for this work, Hood was kind enough to answer some questions. We met several times in London and Brighton, and later he read my translation and corrected some misunderstandings, as one would think when you think of his linguistic skills. And I can recount one telling detail, because I used several Swiss German expressions which are not familiar to the official High German, and who didn't know these expressions but accepted them because, as he said, they would give the translation a flair similar to his sometime use of a Scottish vernacular. After the book was published, we invited him to do some readings and lecture in Switzerland, but sadly his health at that time didn't allow him to travel. Now, in the meantime, as has been mentioned, I have translated 2 further novels by him, which might be seen on the first illustration. because we tried to give them a sort of style, a similar style, and you can see the signature of Stuart Hood to the right. Today and all this day and today, and I was and still fascinated by Hood's wide-ranging connections, because in one of our conversations he mentioned that one figure in his book, A Storm from Paradise, was in part inspired by Rosa Mayer-Leviné, whom he knew in London. Now, Rosa Mayer-Leviné, whom we might see in the second illustration, was an activist in the communist movement in the 20s and 30s, to the left. She was married to two leading exponents of the German Communist Party, firstly to Eugen Leviné, picture to the right, leader of the short-lived Räterepublik, Soviet Republic in Munich in 1990. After uprising was crushed, he was executed on the 5th of June 1919. Rosa Leviné's second husband was Ernst Mayr, twice leader of the KPD, German Communist Party, between 1922 and 1930. In 1934, Rosa Mayer-Leviné immigrated to London, where she lived for the rest of her life till her death in 1979. Now, in old age in London, she wrote two books, which are now accepted as first-hand accounts of the turbulent 20s and 30s, and as an unsparing critic of communist politics. In A Storm from Paradise, Hood gives his figure, Elizabeth de Pass, a somewhat similar trajectory. And he writes that in the 1960s, she organized a sort of salon in the tradition of the Enlightenment in London, where many left-leaning intellectuals, both German exiles and English, met. Indeed, this is true for the real Rosa Mayer-Leviné as well. In her circle, met people like Eric Hobsbawm or the German historian Hermann Weber. Eric Hobsbawm wrote a foreword for the English translation of Rosa Mayer-Leviné's first book. And one of her acquaintances was, as already has been mentioned, Eric Fried, which brings us back to Stuart Hood, and whom we might see on the third illustration. As mentioned before, it is well known that Hood and Fried cultivated a friendship for more than 40 years, sometimes closer, sometimes from distance, but always with respect for the work of the other. Eric Fried himself was once in the 70s the most famous German author. His poems sold in the hundreds of thousands. Today, his books are still available, and there is a literary prize in his name, but his reputation has somewhat swindled, still quite sort of accepted, even grudgingly, but sometimes judged as being a bit, well, old-fashioned, belonging to a long-gone area when, dare one say it, authors thought they could change the world with their poems. I'm pleasantly surprised that this spring, celebrating Fried's 100th birthday in May, 3 new books from and about him will be published. In the foreword to the translation of Fried's love poems, Hood writes about Fried, quote, he believed that you had to follow a categorical imperative, to be both politically engaged and poetically creative, end quote. I think that was true for Stuart himself as well, and this makes him a truly remarkable writer and person, not only for the 20th century, but for the 21st century as well.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for those reflections. We're on to our last two speakers, the two of us who are going to talk about Stuart Hood's novels mainly. The first is Alan Riach. Alan's Professor of Scottish Literature at Glasgow University, and his publications, several major books on Hugh MacDiarmid, and also on Scottish literature more broadly, one of them representing Scotland in literature, popular culture and iconography, The Masks of the Modern Nation in 2005. He's also a very accomplished and acclaimed poet with at least 6 collections of poetry. So over to you, Alan.
Thanks very much. And just to say, it's as it was with the conference that I was there, when I was there, the number of speakers and the number of ways of approaching Stuart Hood And the ways in which his work and his achievement and his life have been extrapolated and introduced here, it's so multiple, it's so multifaceted. I'm learning things all the time when I'm looking at Stuart Hood's work. And in the chapter that I wrote for the book, the essay I wrote for the book, the title was Literature, Media and Politics in Modern Scotland. And the emphasis that I wanted to make was on the interrelatedness of all of these activities in Hood's imagination and in his life, and how you could draw upon that in the novels very specifically, if I'm reading them as a literary scholar and a critic and in such ways, but also increasingly as you look at his work in media and his writing on media and the prophetic nature of that, as I would call it. Brexit has been mentioned, Scottish nationalism has been mentioned, the context of the move of the drive for independence in Scotland. All of these political issues that are still live and still valid and still with us are very pertinent to all the kinds of illumination that Stuart Hood brings to us. And if we don't know the answers to the questions what side he would have been on in certain of these debates, then I'm absolutely certain that I would have wanted his opinion and engagement and conversation with him about them all. And it goes much more, very deeply, I think. It goes right into not only his lived experience, but the writing of the novels, and particularly the first one, which was published, I think, in 1985, Storm from Paradise, which I read in 1986 when I was in New Zealand, and read it as I was teaching Lewis Grassic Gibbon, the Scots Quail of Sunset song, and that idea that Stuart's book was actually looking through a lens into Grassic Gibbon territory, but bringing it forward into his own sensibility and his own understanding, not only of Scotland and Europe, but also of the locality in Scotland and the language that's been mentioned, that kind of vernacular aspect of his own upbringing, which he knew so intimately. It's not the narrative of the novel. It's not the idiom of the narrative of the novel, but it's never far away from your consciousness. But what he's dealing with in terms of intimacy, and I think that one of the startling things about that book is the extent to which he deals with intimacy, physical intimacy, as well as linguistic intimacy in the sense of the physicality of language, taking it from there, from the very personal to the very social, to the interchange between individuals, and to the very political international context that the book expands upon. What I was going to say to begin with really was the Guardian obituary, where Brian Winston recollected Hood remarking, if I go back to Tuscany, I ask myself, well, was it worth it? To establish all these holiday homes, on the other hand, fascism lost. And you can see that kind of personal recollection working through that little quotation, but also that undertow that maybe fascism didn't really lose. Fascism never loses, any more than the ideal and the drive and the purpose of intention to change things for the better never really goes away either. And that conflict that's there in the novels, is dramatized in the novels so brilliantly, I think, is measured, because he's writing in 1985 through, I think, till 1995. There are these 10 years when he's producing the novels, and the experience that he's had before and what he goes on to do, and is doing parallel at the same time in television and media, is understanding of how you get the message across, how you actually convince people that there are these ways of seeing things and what must be done, what you value. His sense of value, I think, was measured, was hammered out in against the absolutism of fascism that he fought against. That sense of the engagement of the someone mentioned there, the desire to experiment and to fail sometimes, but to experiment again in television or in other media. I was always interested in how politics is lived, he said, great quotation, marvelous summary. And that informs the narrative of the characterization of the novels, but also in the I was going to say simplification, but the kind of immediacy of address in the For Beginners series. So the relations between fiction and mass media, the tactics of persuasion through media, which we're in a way much more familiar with now than we were in the 1980s. Many people, I do think, are much more familiar with the deliberate strategies of how information is put across, how persuasion is enacted and performed and done by these in media and through in popular culture, so to speak. Which is why I think the novels themselves are such an enduring achievement. Partly because they have that encompassing quality of Scotland and Europe, partly because they have this moral dimension earned at huge cost, I think, about loyalty and betrayal, about locations and limitations. I sometimes think if you consider yourself British and Scottish, you're the perfect double agent. You can talk at more than one level at the same time and address different contexts in the same time. Whether or not Stuart Hood might have chosen one thing over another in that context, as I say, he's very familiar with the duplicity of lived experience, that lived experience almost inevitably brings upon you. And it comes through in so many of his characters and the dilemmas that they face. Let me end just by suggesting that, well, two brief things to end with, perhaps. When he's talking about television, and just what I'd like to do is, I didn't do this in the chapter, but it occurs to me now that having listened to what I've heard here, push what he says about television across the way a little bit. And I'll come back to this. What he says about television is the criteria by which we should judge it is 1, the range and variety of programs, 2, the degree of freedom it enjoys to show and speak the truth, and 3, its success in revealing a society to itself. On a primitive level, by showing its citizens how they speak, behave, live, and on another higher level, by revealing to them the mechanics of their society and so on. Push that sideways a wee minute, see if that definition applies not only to a national television, but to a national literature, to a culture as a whole. All of these questions are provoked by Hood's work. I'll end just with a quotation. When I said that I read Storm from Paradise and also a little later Carlino, Pebbles from My Skull, and in one of the very first books of poetry that I published when I was in New Zealand, in fact, it went in so deep, that this writing, and so powerfully, that I used a part of it as an epigraph to the book. So let me just read this short, very couple of sentences here to close my section with. It's from Carlino, and it goes like this: Pebbles, Pebbles from my skull, from Pebbles from my skull. Beside the arbia in the moist woods and in the dry scrub of the hillsides, I lay and felt the old security. A mole came burrowing up through the grass at my side. The jays swung on the branches overhead, and the snakes swished and glinted through last year's leaves. We get little help from others in living. What we learn from them are mostly the inessentials of life, tricks and skills. But occasionally we exchange obscure signals. They are reassurances that others face or have faced the same difficulties and problems and choices, and react to the same stimuli, and feel the same joy and anguish. Autobiography is an attempted jailbreak. The reader tunnels through the same dark. I would keep that. I would keep that as the motto for what we're trying to do. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Alan. I'm going to have, as the organizer, have the last word of the speakers before we pass over to Anne Hood to talk, and that'll end us off today. And I'm really just going to try and persuade you in my 5 minutes that the final 5 novels are really worth your time and worth reading. And as a break from my face, Sally, if you could just run through the covers of them. Just the first one was Storm from Paradise, 1985. We have there, that's the one cover. And then the next one was The Upper Hand, 1987. Haim's spoken very eloquently about that. The third one, 1989, The Brutal Heart, and then a much better cover in the German edition that Stefan has showed us already. Sally, if we could just flick to that, as you see, one that much more captures the spirit of the novel. A Den of Foxes in 1991. And then the final one was The Book of Judith in 1995. And yeah, I mean, what I think all 5 of them, I think, you know, they're different in different ways, but all 5 of them share They have protagonists who are versions of Stuart Hood, and they grapple with how the radical intellectual functions in hostile territory defined by capitalism and right-wing nationalism. That's the first thing. So in an adversarial, in a kind of struggling against the world, if you like, but also at the same time looking for communities of resistance. And all the way through the novels, the protagonists are either, in some of the novels, it's anti-fascist groups in 1930s Edinburgh, the partisan bands in Italy during the Second World War, or the different radical political groups in the 60s and 70s in Europe. And the protagonist is trying to find some connection with them, and that marks all the novels. It's important, just looking at the reviews through the period, they were very, very well received, all of them. Just a few quotes from some of the reviewers, very distinguished reviewers. John Sutherland in the LRB said, A Storm from Paradise was beautifully direct and effective portrait of the small town community. Writing about the upper hand, Patricia Craig was very effusive in her praise as well. She says it captures a marvelous evocation of the romantic political temper of the decade, socialism, Spain, agitators. And she also says, and I think this is true, and it's relevant to I'll come back to it in more detail, his ability to put his finger on the flavor of successive eras, the ramshackle busyness of post-war London, the unsettled atmosphere of the 1960s. The next one, The Brutal Heart, also got well reviewed. Lawrence Lerner in the Sunday Times actually reviewed it together with Alex Comfort's novel, The Philosophers, and in a quite brutal review, he says it's hardly an exaggeration to say that they offer a contrast between how and how not to write a political novel. Hood's novel is a model of how you should write a political novel, he says. It's meaningful, exciting, written with fairness and insight. Julian Simons, in also of Den of Foxes, he chose it as one of his books of the year in 1991. Very, very effusive praise for that. And The Book of Judith was the final book. Brian Morton in The Scotsman said that the novel captured the urgency of those days, brilliantly alternating clipped staccato prose that mimics the urgency of clandestine notes and messages and passages of almost lyrical beauty. So there's a lot of praise both for the issues that Hood grapples with in the novels, but also the way they're written. So just to end off, why read them or reread them now? I suppose I think what they do is they think, they wrestle with the challenge of radicals of one generation, how they try to connect and orientate themselves in relation to the political struggles of subsequent generations. How does a radical forged in the 30s and 40s connect with a radical struggle of the 60s and 70s? These are kind of ongoing, tormenting questions for Stuart Hood's protagonists. And I think the complexities of those cross-generational, trying to find a common language across those generations are very, very fine. Hood was drawn to, he was a Marxist, and he was very drawn to Ernst Bloch's famous metaphor of the cold and the warm streams of Marxism. The dialectic of the cold, in Bloch's words, of critique, of the detective, of sobriety, and the warm stream, in, again, Bloch's words, utopia, the liberator, enthusiasm, community. And in Hood's life and work, he never gave up on this dialectic, the warm and the cold stream. He continued both to direct his critical intelligence to understanding and exposing the workings of power. And he thought as a Marxist, connecting economic exploitation to the circulation of ideas. This was his kind of in his DNA. But crucially, and I think this is the point, lots of people can stay critical all their lives. I think what was striking about Hood, as Stuart Hood, was that he retained a commitment to the warm current. He never relinquished his belief in the possibilities of new forms of radical community, and he always had an eye to where they might coalesce, where they might materialize. In the remarkable afterword to Pebbles from My Skull, he describes the one moment in his adult life when his desire for community was met. In Italy in 1944, where he writes, "In Chianti, after a period of absolute exclusion, I became one of a family and a conspiracy. The currents of my life flowed together and swept me along." For Hood, then, the key political lesson of the 30s and 40s was that even under conditions of extreme adversity, forms of collective resistance could coalesce to overcome the sense of what he calls absolute exclusion. This lesson continued to guide him for the rest of his life, as in these final novels, his protagonists continued to identify with new forms of resistance and critique, but also simultaneously sought connections with emergent, if deeply flawed forms of radical community. So I think all of us continue. I think these remain, abiding concerns for all of us now. So that's why I would recommend spending time and rereading them, and they're all remarkably accessible on books, even though they're out of print, easy to get hold of. I'm going to end. We're not going to have time, unfortunately, for your comments and questions. We're going to end off with Anne Hood saying a few words. So David's going to just introduce Anne, and then Anne will talk about, obviously, as Stuart Hood's daughter, Anne knew him better than any of us, and I think it's fitting to end with Anne and giving us her thoughts. Thanks.
All I really want to say is that throughout this project, which began in 2015 with 2 conferences, first of all in the National Library in Edinburgh, and then in London, Anne, Stuart's daughter, has been very supportive of these conferences and supportive of this book project. And what we're really asking her to do now, if she would, is to say a few words and, if you like, formally launch this book about her father. Anne.
Hi. When it was suggested I make a contribution to this event, I thought I am not an academic, literary critic, nor a media expert. So my qualification is the fact that I'm daughter by his first marriage. But first, I read this book expecting a kind of repeat of the centenary lectures held in Edinburgh and London in 2015. It is far from that. I found I was presented with a sweeping view of a sector of left-wing literary, artistic, and political attitudes of the 20th century. The chapters in this well-crafted and largely academic book take me from being the protagonist's daughter to being an interested participant. It's absolutely fascinating. I thought it a great tribute to my father, one that he would quietly have appreciated. This was a man I learnt from a very age to trust implicitly. He never betrayed that trust, and whom somewhere deep inside I understood. Arriving a month late and suntanned for my first day at primary school, I quickly sussed that Italy, where I'd been all September, was not something to talk about. The fact that I swam like a frog, due to Stuart having thrown me at the age of 5 into the warm Mediterranean Sea from the borrowed rowing boat I named Biancaneve, diving in after me saying, "Swim," so I did. Not a good opening gambit for the new girl in the playground. These wonderful Italian holidays where I was so dependent on Stuart being left undisturbed while translating in order to pay for the journey. He drove us across Europe. A real adventure then, on all but the first time in 1950, when we went by train. However, I just sat silently outside the study door, waiting until he needed out, when I bolted in and sat on his typing chair. On his return, he would lift me onto his knee and continue hammering away, disentangling the keys of his black imperial typewriter, the start of his teaching me to type, which continued on some exciting Saturdays when he took me with him to Bush House. The practical skills Stuart taught me, not surprisingly, included, when tired at the age of 3, walking in the Angus Glens, just to keep going. No car, and farm B&B then shut after breakfast until high tea, and a couple of years later, if thirsty, walking in the Apennines, not to mention water, but to take a fruit from the next arbutus tree we passed. He never came to school sports day like the other fathers to see me compete, nor to the concerts locally where I played Bach's Pastoral Symphony on his wooden treble recorder on which he taught me. He just didn't. He read me Isola Bella, a real place I later saw, Biancaneve and Cappuccetto Rosso as bedtime stories, and gave me the complete Grimm's fairy tales, which he later told me were very important in a child's psychological development, as the tales engender fear. I loved them, cherishing the book too. He read them to me, so I had no fear. To quote Aristotle again, Aristotle said, "Give me a child until he is 7, and I will show you the man." I had Stuart weekends, holidays, and bedtime stories, or a goodnight kiss many nights. Not all, I realised later, due to his BBC extracurricular activities for 8 years. I was a tomboy anyway, and he made a very inquisitive, practical person of me. To misquote Tony Garnett from the book, what a time, what a man, and what an exciting father. Finally, a big thank you to all the contributors, and perhaps especially to the two editors, David Hutchison and David Johnson, for their commitment and perseverance in producing an academic work of note. I suggest you buy it.
Thank you very much. David.
Thanks so much, Anne, for those kind words and that amazing insight into your childhood with Stuart. That's extraordinary. We've inevitably, I suppose, thinking about it calmly after the event, we've run horribly over time, all of us ignoring the 5-minute limit. So unfortunately, we're not going to have time to take any questions and comments. I don't know. Yeah, as I said, I don't think it's really fair to choose one with 3 minutes to go. So I'm just going to end off by repeating Anne's thanks, David's thanks to all our speakers and to all of you for sacrificing your evening tonight to come along and listen to us. And yeah, I hope you've enjoyed it, and very best wishes to everybody. Maybe also just a final thanks to the Open University and Sally Blackburn-Daniels for running it, and to the Institute of English Studies for their support. It has provided us with a way of reaching far more people than would normally have been the case. One of the few consolations of the lockdown is that these online events mean far more people get to listen to the more than they normally would. So I'm going to just say good night to everybody, and good night to
David, before you do, there's the special offer from Cambridge Scholars.
Crucial, yes. Do you want to say your bit? There is, if you want to, Sally will maybe put that back on the screen. If you want to buy the hardback version of the book, there's a generous discount if you type in, I think it's Hood 52 on the Cambridge Scholar website. I don't know, Sally, is it possible to click that on the screen? There we go. That's the book, and the discount is, I think it was in your Eventbrite invitation, so you'll be able to get it if you want. It always feels a bit, yeah, I don't know, trying to sell a flogger product at the end of it doesn't seem quite right, but there we go. Thanks again to everyone.